Hello, Cornerstone students. I'm going to do a read aloud from our Story of the World history. This week's chapter is very interesting. It is about the plague. It's called The End of the World, and it's about the Black Plague or the Black Death that happened in Europe and spread all over the world. There's going to be a lot of similarities to what's happening today, but I want you to listen to the story and think about all the things that have changed since a plague like this has happened, right? With the coronavirus or COVID-19, what's going on right now is we know that washing your hands is really important to help the spread of disease. We know that staying home is really important, and that's why we're all making sacrifices to stay home and doing homeschooling instead of schooling together. All of those sacrifices are what's helping save lives. And back then, they didn't know that washing your hands was important. They thought that smelling herbs would keep them safe from the disease. They had all sorts of different things that they thought would help them when they really didn't know. Medicine's come a long way. And even though the Black Plague really affected the entire world in a huge way, we've learned from those mistakes, and that's why we're doing things so drastically right now with the social distancing and isolation and taking precautions, because we've learned from mistakes of the past and we're getting ahead of it. So I want you to listen to the story and think of how far we've come in the world as far as medicine and wise choices. And I want you to be thankful that you live today instead of back then. All right, again, this is chapter 25, The End of the World. This is called The Plague. The people who lived in the Middle Ages had to face one invading army after another: Muslims, Vikings, Crusaders, Mongols, Russians, and Turks. But the most dangerous enemy of all wasn't an army. It was a sickness that spread across the world and killed more people than all these armies put together. At first, strange stories began to come out of the distant parts of China. Travelers told about a mysterious illness that killed almost everyone who caught it. It began with terrible headaches and high fevers. The sick coughed, sneezed, and suffered from terrible pains in their arms and legs. Swollen lumps as large as baseballs appeared under their arms. Rumors said that 35 million people had died from this sickness. 35 million people. That's a lot. Soon the rumors became reality. People who lived near the Black Sea began to grow sick. In the villages and plains nearby, hundreds died. An old story tells us that the villagers blamed foreign merchants from Italy for bringing the sickness. They gathered into an army and drove the Italian merchants into the city of Caffa at the edge of the Black Sea. The people of Caffa and the Italian merchants barred the gates and fought back. So the attackers put the dead bodies of those who had died from the sickness into catapults and hurled them over the walls. Soon illness broke out in Caffa as well. The Italian merchants panicked. They ran from Caffa, boarded their ships, and sailed back home to Italy. But by the time they got there, almost everyone on board the ship was sick or dead. The people of Italy refused to let them come ashore. But despite this, the sickness soon appeared on land. It spread through Italy, up into Europe, across the sea to England, and down into North Africa. Millions of people died. No one could stop this sickness, which people called the Black Death. An Italian writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived during the Black Death, describes it in his book, The Decameron. Here is a retelling of part of his story. Doctors were helpless. Most people who got sick died within 3 days. Anyone who came near the sick or touched their clothing became sick also. This actually sounds worse than the coronavirus. With my own eyes, I saw the clothes of a beggar who died of plague thrown out into the road. 2 pigs came along and nosed at the clothes. Not an hour later, both pigs began to turn round and round, and then, just as if they had been poisoned, dropped dead in the road. Thousands of people grew sick every day, and there was no one left to take care of them. Many fell down in the streets and died where they lay. Bodies were everywhere. I hope you're already telling a difference between then and now. Obviously, we're being a lot more careful, and people are being taken care of. There were so many dead that there were not enough priests to bury them all. Many times a priest would begin to lead a funeral procession and then would look behind him and find that 3 or 4 other coffins had fallen in behind him to join the burial service. And when the bodies arrived at the churchyards, they were thrown into huge trenches with hundreds of others covered only with a thin layer of dirt. When the sickness came to the cities, many people shut themselves up in their houses and refused to come out. Others pretended that nothing was wrong and went about singing and eating and drinking and having parties at all hours. They wandered into any house they pleased and used it as their own, and no one cared because so many houses were left empty by the dead. Some carried with them, no matter where they went, flowers and scented herbs that they held to their noses. Others left the city and fled into the country. But many of these people fell sick as well. Farmers died, their crops lay ungathered in the fields, and their oxen and donkeys wandered free into the fields, glutting themselves with grain. Oh, how many lords and ladies died, leaving their rich houses empty. How many families perished, leaving not a single heir. How many brave men, beautiful women, and strong youths ate breakfast in the morning with their families and friends, and then that same evening ate supper with their ancestors in the world which is to come. And there were no tears or candles or mourners. So many died that soon no one paid any more attention to dead bodies of people than they did to the dead bodies of goats. Today, scientists know that the Black Death was an illness we call Bubonic Plague. The plague was an infection carried by fleas that lived on rats. When traders moved along the Silk Road from China back towards the Black Sea, the rats came with them, eating the grain they carried and hiding in their bales of cloth. The rats and the fleas ran through the countryside and into the city of Caffa. When the Italian traders left Caffa, the rats went with them in the cargo holds of their ships, and when the Italian ships arrived back in Italy, the rats ran down the anchored ropes onto shore, even though the 6 sailors stayed on board. So they weren't sure how the sickness came from the ship to land, but it was the rats that took the illness down on the ropes that were anchoring the ships to the docks. From there, the fleas that carried the disease went from rat to rat all over Europe. Rats were everywhere in the Middle Ages. Thankfully not like that now. Cities threw their garbage and leftover food into the streets, so there was always plenty of food for them, and wherever the rats went, the Black Death went with them. But people of the Middle Ages didn't know that rats were spreading the disease. Some thought that the plague was the judgment of God. Others thought that it had been caused by earthquakes, evil spirits, or bad food. No one knew how to prevent it. They carried flowers and herbs with them, ate onions and garlic to keep sickness away, and slept on their stomachs instead of their backs so that the sickness wouldn't settle down into their noses at night. But nothing helped. One medieval history tells us, so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. So if you notice, some of the things they thought would help would be carrying flowers and herbs to smell, thinking that that would prevent anything from getting in their nose, not laying on their backs because they didn't want the illness to settle in their nose when they were sleeping, eating garlic and onions, which actually garlic can boost your immune system, but it's not like medicine to prevent you from getting an illness. They had no idea how to stop it. So here's a picture. It says, during the plague, doctors wore bird outfits to avoid catching the illness. They thought that this would help them not catch the illness. If anything, it's more creepy, but did nothing for them, really, except maybe cover their face a little bit. This next section is called A New Way of Living. Yes, Lincoln? He's raising his hand.
I wanted to tell you that they thought that would help prevent them from getting sick, but it just prevented them from spreading their germs.
Good point. A new way of living. The Black Death raged for years. When the plague finally ended, a very different world was left. 1 out of every 3 people had died. Whole villages and towns were wiped out. Fields grew up full of tangles and weeds. Grain rotted before it could be harvested. So we already have seen, like China had a huge curve up, right? They had a ton of people get sick, and then they started to go down once they started taking precautions, right? So now less people are sick, less people are dying. This is not taking years, right? It may take a long time to recover from this, even the coronavirus, but it's not going to take years, and it's not going to wipe out 1/3 of our population because we have different medicine, different knowledge, and we're being smarter about it.
That won't happen.
Right, it's not going to happen like that for us.
1/3, that's no.
Right. Cows, sheep, and pigs wandered loose and turned wild or died because there was no one to look after them. Noblemen who owned huge estates wanted their fields to be farmed again, but so many peasants had died that they couldn't find anyone to work on their land. One priest wrote, "So few servants and laborers were left that nobody knew where to turn for help. The following autumn it was not possible to get a harvester. Because of this, many crops were left to rot in the field." The peasants and farmers who were left alive found themselves in very high demand. Everyone wanted them. They no longer had to work for nothing on the land of rich farmers. Instead, they could demand to be paid higher wages. The noblemen who had to pay them grew poorer because they couldn't afford to pay workers to farm all their land. Their huge estates grew smaller and smaller. The peasants and farmers grew a little bit richer and were able to buy land of their own. The feudal system, in which peasants worked for noblemen in exchange for land, began to fall apart. Many of the villagers wiped out by the plague were never rebuilt. The villages. The survivors went to the cities instead. As more and more people left the countryside, the cities began to grow larger. So craftsmen, workers who could make wagon wheels, barrels, iron tools, cloth, and other goods, went to the cities as well, where they could sell their crafts to more people. Priests, left with empty churches, moved into the city also. We call this move out of the country and into the city urbanization. Urban is the Latin word for town or city, so urbanization means becoming citified. There's a little Latin lesson for you. Back out in the country, hundreds of farms and houses were left empty. Some of the peasants who remained moved into these unclaimed houses and farmed and deserted land as their own. They took over their masters' beds, clothes, tools, and flocks, and there was no one to chase them out. They became the new owners of this land. In one city in Scandinavia, everyone died except for one little girl. She lived with the animals for years until rescuers came along and discovered her. By then, she had forgotten what other people were like. She was afraid of them and preferred the animals. But the rescuers took her in and taught her to be human again. When she grew up, they gave her all the land in the whole town since she was the only survivor. She and her family became the new noblemen of that city. Becoming a craftsman was easier too. Before the Black Death, anyone who wanted to follow a special trade such as weaving, wagon building, and carpentry, or ironwork had to be an apprentice or student for many years. But after the plague, few craftsmen were left. Wagon wheels, iron tools, and blankets were soon in short supply. So the length of time that an apprentice had to study before setting up his shop became much shorter. The Black Death even changed the land itself. Before the plague, forests all over Europe had been cut down and the land turned into fields. But now, with so few farmers left, the trees began to grow back. Forests sprang up all over Europe. 70 years after the Black Death ended, the woods had grown up so close to the borders of the huge city of Paris that wolves skulked along the city's edges. And 150 years after the plague, huge, dense woods covered mile after mile where farmland and villages had once stood. The Black Death is long past, but it left its traces all over the people and the land of the Middle Ages. And today we still have at least one reminder of the plague with us. Have you ever heard this nursery rhyme? Ring-around-the-Rosie, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Many historians think that this nursery rhyme got its start in the days of the Black Death. Ring-around-a-Rosie describes a red rash that broke out on sick people. A pocket full of posies is a bouquet of flowers and herbs that many people carried to keep sickness away. Today we say ashes, ashes, but in the oldest version of this rhyme, the third line goes, a tissue, the sound of an ill person sneezing. And all fall down reminds us that most people who caught the plague died. You might think again next time you sing that nursery rhyme. So again, I decided to read this chapter because I think it's a good opportunity for you to have a conversation with your parents about what's going on today and how the world has learned so much since then and we're better off for it. What are you doing to help prevent the spread of the coronavirus? What is the nation doing? What is the world doing? What does that look like? Lincoln?
I think nursery rhymes always have to have something really scary and dangerous.
That's a great question. I don't know why they write songs for kids. Maybe they wrote that nursery rhyme because they wanted kids to remember or preserve a part of history in a less scary way. Who knows? That's a great question to talk with your family about.
They always have something scary.
I
like
know.
Rockabye Baby. Rockabye Baby in the treetops. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. And down will fall baby, cradle and all.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. We'll have to figure that out. All right. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys have some really fruitful conversations with this. And don't forget to pray. Pray for your loved ones. Pray for the nation. Pray for the world that we can all be protected and this virus will be taken care of the way that it's meant to be taken care of.
Unlike the Black Death.
Yes, unlike the Black Death. We will prevail. All right. Thanks for listening.